This is the stelae of Semen, the bowman. This bowman represents a fully wealthy person who was not a pharaoh, a king, a noble, but instead someone who worked himself into riches. He represents what can be gained from the history of Egypt and what might be lost if we give up because of one or two studies. You see, Egypt is not just a representative of simple education or visual appearance or the arrogance of what humans can achieve when they try hard enough. And not only that, it's not a representation of a purely African thing. Instead, it represents the fact that no matter how many times people can look inside of Africa, they can see exactly what we were capable of and exactly what we were willing to leave behind, not only to our own children, but to the thousands of years later children, and show them exactly how we lived. Not only did the ancient Egyptians leave us these spectacular buildings, but they also left us our modern world. Over the years, no matter what technology comes out before the DNA came out, this civilization has been used for multipolar or multi purpose people, anybody but the Africans, with the few exception of people who point out that no, I think these people are African. When I observe it, I can see it. Some even resting at mulatto, saying that these people, if at the very least, they have to be partially black African. Now, these words have resonated for a long time, which is why we can pull them from any time in history, starting from the Persians all the way till now, but we don't necessarily have to do that. See, one of the things that happened in Egypt is that they had, even though Egypt, the true Egypt, if you look at some of the later years, that already had the desert, right? They already had the desert. They still show abundance. And this abundance, they clearly say, comes from their neighbors, their African neighbors, Libyans and Sudanese and people like that. But I always ask myself this question of, in what world, in what world do you exclude the people that the ancient Egyptians themselves include? So in that stele that I was talking about, they have food from as far as Nubia. Some of it has been alleged to come from places as far as Central Africa. That trade was happening back then all the way down there, and some plates or some bowls made in Egypt have found their way down there. But first, let me address something that I find very ironic or silly or crazy, which is, let's start with the DNA test about, Asiatic people being around in Africa, though dark skin and all of that other stuff. I love how somehow, I don't even know how this happened. I love how somehow there's this narrative or there's this placement that is somehow flipped where people are pretending like Africans or whoever are disappointed to know that there were people from other parts of the world in their lands. When I think about it, who exactly invented this idea of racial purity, of a specific group not being allowed in a specific land? Who said that Africans were uncomfortable or did not like the idea that there would be people from Sumeria in Egypt? I find that weird that that's sort of flipped now, and it's this idea that the black Africans came up with that. Remember, we're not the ones who are discluding, for the most part, discluding people from Egypt. It's the other way around, where people are claiming that they're the true Egypt. Egypt is for Egyptians. Remember that phrase? We're not the ones saying that there couldn't have been other people in Egypt. Instead, there were several people who I could play at any moment who are saying that the black African culture represents nothing about Egypt, even though the history shows a completely different thing. Perhaps the study itself is not problematic and the results are just a result. And remember that scholars, just like the 2017 study, they're very careful to say this is one study in North Egypt that had, that has limited information, even though it's a whole genome ancestry of a ancient Egyptian person from the old kingdom. And they take this as like, oh, this must be a full thing. Here's my question to you: how many people do you think are going to have like 20% Sumerian DNA or Mesopotamian DNA in Egypt? Do you think this is representative of all the people living in Egypt? Or do you think this is one of those special cases? 20% of a place like Mesopotamia, that would mean, if it's standard, if this is just a standard Egyptian, that would mean that that DNA is not Mesopotamian. That you can't call it Mesopotamian DNA. That 20% will mean nothing as information. By the way, I'm glad you guys were around when I said this. Remember when I said I've made some predictions about, before the study came out, I said I've made some predictions about what DNA is going to come out. And I said that it's going to be a long time before they come out with another study. And when they do, it's going to try and delete every single piece of African DNA that they have come out with. And they don't want to make the mistake that they've made last time, where at least one of them was black African and it was touted around the entire internet. If you go look around the internet, people are going, I'm related to this pharaoh. It turns out I have this DNA that's related to this pharaoh. And, they don't want to make that mistake again. Having said that, I have a famous saying, I didn't make it up, that says, the truth does not fear any question. So, in other words, just because things don't line up with what I want to be true doesn't mean I'm not going to accept it as a reality, which is why I accept the study as a reality, but I accept it as a reality for real, for what it is. Nothing that I'm about to say right now is a lie. This is one person, a whole genome study of one person who happens to be in the early days, and his DNA seems to show some foreign signs, meaning that he does not represent the general Egyptian. Nothing I said was weird. And here's another thing that's not weird. This further goes into what we were saying, that there has been migrations inside of Egypt that's been going on for so long. They've been going on for so long that these people sometimes don't listen to themselves. They call Egypt a multicultural area, yet they say the population of Egypt is Egyptian, which I've said this before. How can you be a heterogeneous species and a homogeneous species at the same time? It doesn't make sense. You choose one. You say either it was a crossroads and the people were constantly coming in and out and there is no one population of Egypt, or you say there was a population of Egypt but they were replaced, or they were never replaced, and you should not find much foreign DNA inside of Egypt. How can you go anywhere outside of that? And people go, oh, our ancestors have been removed by the black Africans because they say that we moved in from Asia. This study says that though. That's the funny part. It's like this study literally says that this guy's ancestors came from somewhere in Asia. I want to play a little bit of a snippet of a video that I have about the ancient Egyptians, and it's from a previous video. And I promise the reason why I'm playing this has nothing to do with the characters inside the video. It only has to do with my point that I'm about to make, which is why I need to play it to show how consistent some of the beliefs that I have about the past have been, and why I'm not shocked by some of the DNA evidence that comes out today. But yet I'm still waiting for further evidence, and I'm willing to change my mind at any time. But I'm gonna need way more than one study or one test.
Besides, when we look at the archaeological evidence, in my opinion, it becomes more difficult to categorically state that Nakada culture definitely derives from the south, independently from a possible ethnic connection with the Nubians. Nakada people from the chiefdom at Hierakonpolis conducted a violent expansion into Lower Nubia in the mid-4th millennium BC. The violent encounters with the natives are testified through evidence of interpersonal violence in 5 cemeteries of the predecessors of the A group people, young males buried with weapons in a Nakada cemetery in A group territory, and a settlement pattern shifting southward. And this kind of violent confrontation, which is backed by archaeology, seems to suggest that the ancient Nakada culture, which was created and originated in Upper Egypt, was in fact distinct from the Nubian Group A culture.
It's true that the Nakada culture fought to the A group culture, and that there are some Middle Eastern items and maybe even Middle Eastern people who are coming in from that area. But this does not mean they don't belong to the same culture. To me, this is the same as saying that the Japanese during the Middle Ages definitely were not the same culture because they fought against each other. This doesn't make any sense. They're the same culture. They're just fighting against each other because they have differences. And in some cases, they have differences that are made up, which are trying to make them feel like they're not of the same group, even though they are.
Fought. Still, from the American Journal of Physical Archaeology we read, the Ethiopian element present in the crania in connection to the Nakada culture is absolutely a real thing, but it doesn't characterize in a univocous way the ethnicity phenotype of the culture, and above all, its variation, which show, just like the previous Badarian culture, important influxes from the Near East on a genetic basis. So what this shows is that we are in front of a continuous superimposition of different ethnic groups throughout the history of Egyptian culture, including the possibility of the Natufiana culture from the Near East, which brought farming and left a genetic trace. This is why, to me, the idea that elements of the Nakada culture, having conquered, had imposed themselves as a ruling class in Egypt is too simplistic of a vision, and the most recent analyses opt for a much more articulated picture with a long process of cultural exchange, violence between Upper and Lower Egypt. In particular, imagining the Nakada culture as being entirely an emission from further south contradicts the archaeological evidence independently from a possible ethnic connection with the Nubians. The violent encounters with the natives are testified through evidence of interpersonal violence in 5 cemeteries of the predecessor of the A group people. Another interesting piece of connection between the Near East and ancient Egyptian culture, including the Nakada culture, is that when we look at this statue from the Nakada culture, we see that it's very similar to this Sumerian statue and the statue of this Badarian culture and this Badarian statue. Similarly, we can testify to this influx of cultural elements from the Near East, which intensify particularly during the Nakta II or Gerze culture.
Similarities from the Middle East can easily be explained away through trade and through small pockets of people coming in, as we see this in multiple areas in history. India is a good example. Polynesia is a good example. We find many places in history where there's a little bit of trade, and this then builds a different culture. If you want to find a task, go look up Khoi culture, the Khoi culture, or even East African farming. A lot of influence you get without any cultural fusion or genetic fusion. This happens a lot. And given how many times Egypt and Asia came together, I'm not surprised that there is cultural fusion. Remember, it's easier to pass a language, it's easier to pass tools, and it's easier to pass weapons and animals than it is for people to just move in and completely take over.
If the nearest element is a lie created and fabricated by the West, then how do you explain these similarities? As a demonstration of this slow but constant migration of Near Eastern elements throughout the entire history of Egypt, we see that DNA analysis of Egyptian mummies at Abu Sir el-Melek includes specimens starting from the New Kingdom, which show an affinity with the genetic heritage of the Near East of Neolithic and Bronze Age cultures. And what I just said was from the University of Cambridge. So why should I not believe them? Why should I think that the University of Cambridge is lying? Still, when
Since we trust the University of Cambridge, how about these studies that show that the ancient Ethiopians from 4,500 years ago were fully 100% African, and so they show that the Ethiopians or the Asiatics that did a back migration into Ethiopia came within the last 3,000 years, because 4,500 years ago, the people were completely Ethiopian. Now, if we consider this, then that means that there is very little time for the Afro-Asiatic language to take over. Secondly, there's very little time for the people to genetically take over. And it also means that the ancient Egyptians who came in by 2000 BC would have been a more recent influence than a more older one, as old as some of these Nakada A culture people that we're talking about. Okay, so welcome back to the future. So basically, what I'm showing there is that I always had a space open for the fact that there would have been some Asiatics and even a good number, a good population of them located in Egypt, which is easily explainable inside of Egypt because, of course, they were trade partners and Egypt was not afraid of the Asiatics. And so they had no reason to block them from ever coming inside of Africa. And so I have no problem, as you can see in my video. I made it quite clear that the Asiatics had a possibility of coming as early as 2000 BC, and that when they came, though, you have to acknowledge, because I noticed a contradiction that I didn't point out in that previous video by Metatron, where he says that he doesn't believe that there was a great replacement, but then he talks about the fight between the Nubians and the Asiatics that left a replacement. I didn't notice that before, but I'm glad I watched this again so that I can notice that. But my first thing is, when you watched my first video, the first one that I showed over there, you can see that there is quite obvious detail that I did not leave out. And even the study that has just come out, almost all the evidence that, I mean, collectively we put on the table here is revised inside the study, which I will read. I think it's important for me to reread it. One of the things that I did say was, I'm going to try and ignore DNA. I said this before this DNA came out, because I'm kind of suspicious about how long some of this DNA takes to come out. But I think it's fine to read it, but I'm not going to pretend like I'm some kind of super expert on it. So, you know what? I want to play this part one last time because, of course, there's this idea that I'm not balanced on these concepts, and I want to make sure that people understand. So, again, let's play this 10-second clip of what I said before. It's true that the Nakada culture fought to the A group culture, and that there are some Middle Eastern items and maybe even Middle Eastern people who are coming in from that area. But So let's just go straight to the study now that you know that my worldview had never been in a position where I completely discount the idea that there were people from the Middle East coming in. And of course, I always left room for the fact that skin color would not have mattered to these people because a lot of people in that time would have been black to these people. And partially due to the fact that ancient Egypt had had so many, the Nine Bows had had so many foreigners anyway near them, it is possible that they were even open to the ideas of foreigners entering their kingdom. Now, again, I'll say there's a contradiction here on the other side, which is yes, there were foreigners who came like Natufians or all these other people for a long time, but no, they did not replace the original population. That is a contradiction. Either there were foreigners who came from the Middle East and replaced the original population, or it didn't happen. It can't be both. So let's read this study again because I only read a few parts of it. And when I saw some other people covering it, I think it's kind of unfair to cover the parts that I think is going to be more advantageous. So I think it's important that I talk about the entire study and comment as I go along. So it says ancient Egypt society flourished for millennia, reaching its peak during the dynasty period, approximately 3150 to about 30 BC. Huh. However, owing to poor DNA preservation. Well, I would change that and say ancient Egyptian society flourished for millennia, reaching its peak during the dynasty period, approximately 3150 to 30 BCE, but it continued through Sudan and other places that had picked up the tradition and kept going with it well into the 300 ADs. But that's my own thing. However, owing to, and I think that's actually a little biased because again, I think the reason why they don't consider it Egyptian culture, even though they were influenced by Egyptian culture, were mimicking Egyptian culture and to some degree abandoned their own culture in order to do that. I think it's kind of unfair. Also, they mixed with the ancient Egyptians in order to get there. I think it's very unfair because when I look at some of the genetic studies that they do, when they find Egyptians in Asia, as far as Syria, they go, "Oh, we found an Egyptian culture in Syria." You found an Egyptian culture in Syria, but you've never found any Egyptian culture in Sudan. And if you did, how can you say that it stopped at 30 BC when you know the Sudanese people continued Egyptian culture way beyond that? That does not seem fair to me. However, owing to poor DNA preservation, questions about regional interconnectivity over time have not been addressed because whole genome sequencing has not yet been possible. Well, I mean, even Metatron within the thing and me talked about how it would be possible for them to have connectivity even without giving what's that information, even without passing DNA back and forth. Here, we sequenced a 2x coverage whole genome from an adult male Egyptian excavated at Nuarat, radiocarbon dated to 2855. Be careful, I think Zahi Hawass does not believe in radiocarbon dating. 2855 is a long time ago, and I will admit that my statements stopped at around 2000 BC, which is not that far away from this, where I said that around 2000 BC, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some Mesopotamians that ended up inside of this region due to some of those images that were Mesopotamian like. And of course, everybody is sort of shocked because some of the people had settled on the idea that ancient Egyptian culture is so different than Mesopotamian culture that the influence couldn't have been that deep. And some people still go with that, and I pretty much still go with that it was minimal influence on both sides, and that just because we don't see it in Mesopotamia doesn't mean it did not happen. And also, there's a lot of lack of DNA evidence from Mesopotamia. A lot of the evidence from when you hear evidence from Mesopotamia, a lot of it, in fact, almost all of it, has to do with modern people being genetically tested. And so even this one, when they say they found the DNA from Mesopotamia, you must remember not a lot of it has to do with DNA they discovered a long time ago. The only one I know about is the one from 2022 that was talking about the ancient DNA from Mesopotamia and how there was two different types at that time. And I want to know which type are they talking about, because a lot of it had to do with the Turks versus Iraq type DNA. So I want to know which one they think that this DNA, the 20% represents. But let's go back. So continuing, the body was interred in a ceramic pot within a rock cut tomb, potentially contributing to the DNA preservation. Most of his genome is best represented by North African Neolithic ancestry among available sources at present. Now you'll notice how careful they're being about how they present this information, because you must remember these people are doing study, and so they're not, you know, let's say internet trolls who have to show and be like, yes, this is the information and it could not change. So basically they're saying, compared to North Africans today, there is some appearance of continuity. Yet approximately 20% of his genetic ancestry can be traced to genomes representing the Eastern Fertile Crescent, including Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. Now, keep that in mind as a statement of what I said. So, some people are taking it to mean that this person is a full representative of the modern Egyptians and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of modern Egyptians lack this DNA. That's why this DNA is associated with outsiders and not with insiders, or they don't have the DNA at a percentage that is even close to this person. Some of them, including Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. This genetic affinity is similar to the ancestry appearing in Anatolia and the Levant during the Neolithic and Bronze Age. Although more genomes are needed to fully understand the genomic diversity of early Egyptians, pause again, these guys, they don't have any throwaway lines. Although more genomes are needed to fully understand the genomic diversity of early Egyptians. I love that that's already inside of their thinking, that there must be some level of diversity. And this is based on the fact, well, I think this is based on the fact that we already have found Black African DNA inside Egypt. We already have found, based on this, Middle Eastern DNA. So obviously they are not settled like some people are. I've seen actual scientists online be like, well, I guess this is proof that all Egyptians or most Egyptians must have had this type of DNA. But it's like, this guy is an exception, even if you take all the evidence that we have already. Our results indicate that contacts between Egypt and the Eastern Fertile Crescent were not limited to objects and imagery. Now, remember in that video that I just played, that was the question I was talking about. I mean, I could play it again if you want me to repeat it. It's true that the Nakada culture fought to the A group culture, and that there are some Middle Eastern items and maybe even Middle Eastern people who are coming in from that area. But so let's also carry on and see. Although more genomes are needed, blah blah blah. Our results indicate the contacts between Egypt and the Eastern Fertile Crescent were not limited to objects and imagery, such as domesticated animals and plants, as well as the writing system, but also encompassed human migration. See, that's where the hard part becomes, like the writing system. Is it possible that the Sumerians seeded the ancient Egyptian writing system? And of course, why did they diversify so greatly from one another, especially the fact that you can't see any version of deep writing in between Mesopotamia and Egypt? It's Egypt and Mesopotamia. That's it. But if we look at the maps of Mesopotamia and Egypt, it's very confusing why the in between regions of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and some people call it the Fertile Crescent because they say that it was from Mesopotamia, this arc, all the way to Egypt. But what is the earliest writing system in Israel? Wouldn't that be part of the arc? What about further up? I think the oldest writing in Israel is about 1000 BC. Now, take how far or how long ago ancient Egyptian writing was. 1000 BC is nothing. And of course, that 1000 BC has something to do with the Proto Sinaitic script and blah, 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 blah. But if the Mesopotamians influenced the Egyptians, why in such a limited way? Why not influence some of the other people in the Fertile Crescent on journey? So, if we continue to read, for thousands of years, the ancient Egyptian dynastic civilization, approximately 3150 to 30 BCE, developed monumental architecture, sophisticated technology, and relatively stable belief systems. To be honest, the ancient Egyptians have probably had the longest lasting religion ever in history. So I understand what they're saying. But a lot of this is just has nothing to do with the DNAs, but we'll continue reading it. Becoming the longest lasting civilization known following the political unification of the northern and southern regions of Egypt at the end of the fourth millennium BC, the Old Kingdom 2686 to 2125 BCE witnessed considerable advances, including the construction of the first step pyramid complex of King Djoser and the Great Pyramid of Giza built by King Khufu. The population has been considered to be of local origin with limited input from neighboring regions. Again, very important information. Let's go back. Witnessed considerable advances, including the construction of the first step pyramid complex of King Djoser and Great Pyramids of Giza, built by King Khufu. The population has been considered to be of local origin with limited input from neighboring regions. Yet more recent archaeological evidence shows that the trade connections existed across the Fertile Crescent since at least the 6th millennium BC, if not earlier. Now, I don't like the fact that they only talk about the Fertile Crescent and they don't talk about the other trades that must have happened. It sort of sets it up as a directional thing, like they were their only trade partners. Let's be honest about who else must have been here so that the information can be balanced. If not earlier, with the advent of Neolithic package, such as domesticated animals and plants, cultural exchange continued to develop through the late 4th millennium BCE with the growing Sumerian civilization of Mesopotamia. This period overlapped with the appearance of additional innovations in Egypt, and the earliest evidence of hieroglyphs writing in the form of ivory tags in Tomb UJ at Abydos, dated 3320 to 3150 BCE. Now, I want you guys to notice, first of all, how old some of this writing is. So it's not obvious that the Mesopotamians 100% influenced the writing, even with this DNA. Maybe they helped advance it or whatever, but it's not obvious because of just how old it is. Our knowledge of ancient Egyptians has increased through decades of bioarchaeological analysis, including dental morphological studies on their relatedness to other populations in North Africa and West Africa. However, the lack of ancient genomes, particularly for the early periods of Egyptian dynastic history, remains a barrier to our understanding of population continuity and gene flow in the region. Although individuals from ancient Egypt were subjected to the first effort of isolate ancient DNA, direct genome sequencing has remained elusive because of the challenging regional DNA preservation conditions. So far, only 3 individuals from Abusir el Malek have yielded nuclear DNA, all post dating and emergence of dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. Moreover, these are not complete genome sequences, but are limited to approximately 90,000 to 400,000 target enriched genotypes over the millennia spanning the dynastic period. I remember trying to make this a bigger point last time when I said like the pharaohs that have been the DNA of the pharaohs that have been taken when they said they could only find the matrilineal version of it. I was like, well, or the patrilineal or whatever. I was like, well, that sounds like the study is not complete. They'll celebrate this one, but they don't go and re-review the old one and say, why did we make conclusions based on that old one? Just like we're making conclusions based on this one when we could just leave it open. Over the millennia spanning the dynastic period, Egypt witnessed several wide ranging wars, occupation by foreign rulers, and dramatic episodes of internal political collapse. And of course, the DNA never changed the entire time because that makes a lot of sense, guys. Remember that over the millennia, not over 10 years, not over 100 years, not over 1,000 years, over the millennia, thousands of years spanning the dynastic period, Egypt witnessed several wide ranging wars, occupation by foreign rulers, and dramatic episodes of internal political collapse. Yet the genetic stayed 100% Egyptian. uh, that part is crazy. I don't know why they keep saying that. I even said it before. I said, even if I accept that they were white people, like that they were blonde, blue eyed white people, even if I were to accept that, that doesn't take away the fact that clearly these people had wars bringing in new people. People are like, oh, you're saying they replaced the entire population. I didn't say they replaced the entire population. I'm saying a significant amount of the population must have changed due to thousands of years of war. First, second, and third intermediate periods, together, these processes may have substantially altered or reshaped the overall genetic structure and ancestry of the Egyptian population. They may have. It's possible. Here we present a whole genome sequence of an ancient Egyptian individual. 202 covered supplementary table A recovered from a necropolis at Nuarat. Now, this is why I kind of like the study because, as you can see, they've got a sort of balanced view. They do cover the fact that, okay, so there were tons of people who are coming in from other places. Maybe this is an undocumented war, an undocumented exchange, but it is an exchange nonetheless. I'm not making any conclusions, as I've seen some other people go, oh, we've got the whole genome study. That means everybody in Egypt looked like this, and they were the real Egyptians, and the new ones have never been replaced. Like, what are you talking about? The study that you read leaves space for that. The second thing, which I've seen a lot of videos leave out, is the geographical location of Nuarat. And you can see that it's almost at the center of Egypt in terms of south and north, but it isn't located too far north where you can use the idea, the concept that these are just northerners. Geographic location of the Neurat symmetry, red dot, and the previously sequenced third intermediate period individuals from Abu Sir el Malek, pottery vessels in which the Neurat individuals were discovered, Saracen, blah, blah, blah. I don't think we need to read that. Summary of genomic and radiocarbon data, see the detailed breakdown of the continuity indicators and collaborators result for the three replicates and the combined date and supplementary table, Egyptian civilization timeline and radiocarbon date of the Numerat and third intermediate period individuals, mitochondrial data reproduced courtesy of Garstag Museum of Archaeology. Okay, and now the moment we've all been waiting for. Nuarat is located near the village of Beni Hassan, 260 kilometers to 65 kilometers south of Cairo. Radiocarbon dating of the skeletal remains showed that the Nuarat individual died between 2855 and 2570 BCE. Supplementary information, section 1, and supplementary, which overlaps with the early dynastic and Old Kingdom period. This result supports the initial archaeological assessment that material culture and funerary practices at the site were consistent with those of the third and fourth dynasties of the Old Kingdom. The body was placed in a large pottery vessel inside a rock cut tomb. I wish they provided a picture. This treatment would have ordinarily been reserved for individuals of a higher social class relative to others at the site, as observed elsewhere during the early dynastic period and at the Old Kingdom royal cemeteries near the city of Memphis. Although acknowledging known limitations is predicting phenotype traits in understudied populations, the Neurod individual is predicted to have had brown eyes, brown hair, and skin pigmentation ranging from dark to black skin, with a lower probability of intermediate skin color, meaning his skin color was not average color. So, average compared to today, if you mix the colors, it would be something closer to the darker shades. The individual was genetically male with XY chromosomes. Don't tell that to some people. Consistent with the expression of standard skeletal features. Our further osteological examination revealed that he would have stood 157 centimeters. He lived to an advanced age for the time of 44 to 64. 64 is pretty advanced for any era, even today, really. The upper end of the range, this range is the most probable, as evidenced by the heavily worn teeth and age related osteo, whatever, in most joints and vertebrae. In some cases, severe this and various activity induced musculoskeletal indicators of stress revealed that he experienced an extended period of physical labor, seemingly in contrast to his high status tomb burial. The patterns of osteoarthritis and stress indicators further imply the form of physical activity that he routinely engaged in, which some researchers maintain can provide clues concerning occupation. In this case, although circumstantial, they are not inconsistent with those of a potter as depicted in ancient Egyptian imagery. Estimates of biological affinity based on dental morphological features and cranial measurement parallel the genomic result. More detailed information about the Neurat individual is presented in supplementary information section. with a facial depiction in Supplementary Information Section 3. So this is the final part before they go into the actual DNA. Multi-isotope analysis was conducted on dental enamel and dental collagen. The lower left second molar to determine his childhood diet and geographic origin. All results are consistent with having grown up in the hot, dry climate of the Nile Valley. Indicates Vienna standard mean ocean water and consuming an omnivorous diet based on the terrestrial animal protein and plants such as wheat and barley. Indicates Vienna PD belemnite, typical for Egyptian until the Coptic period, an elevated value frequently observed in isotope studies of ancient Egyptians, may have been caused by the arid environment, eating foods raised on manure fields, and or inclusion of Nile fish in the diet. So here, ancient genome sequencing, 7 cementum enriched DNA extracts were prepared into single-stranded DNA sequences libraries and screened on an Illumina platform. 5 of these libraries showed the degradation patterns expected for ancient DNA with evidence of elevated rates of cytosine to thymine substitution at the first base of the sequence alignments and low contamination estimate. For both nuclear and mitochondrial DNA, the 2 remaining libraries were discarded because of elevated contamination estimates, data, and supplementary. The 2 libraries and with the highest proportions of reading mapping to the reference human genome 3.2 of all sequence were further sequenced on Illumina Nova Sequence 6000 and Nova Sequence X platform to generate a total of 8.3 billion 2 times 100 sequence red pairs. We merged the Neurot genome with those of 3.233 present day individuals that were either whole genome sequenced or genotyped on the Human Origins Array, and 805 ancient individuals with either whole genome or 1.2 million single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP captured data. We first projected the Neurot genome in the principal component analysis, PCA, using a population panel representing present-day worldwide genetic diversity. The Neurot individual is genetically most similar to present-day people in North Africa, West Asia, which is consistent with the result from admixture clustering. The mitochondrial DNA haplogroup N1A1B2 and chromosome Y haplogroup E1B1B1 2B, which haplogroups of Neurot individuals are most common in present day North Africa and West Asian groups. Now, this is one of the places where I get confused because there is some talk about where E1B1B1 came from, and we'll talk about that. I think it came from East Africa, actually. I think that's what most people conclude. But remember, there was that East African study I told you about, certain people. Haplogroup of Neurot individuals are most common in present-day North Africa and West Asian groups, consistent with the whole genome affinities. Furthermore, the Neurot genome had no extended runs of homozygosticity above 4 cm, indicating no recent consanguinity in his ancestry. It's a pretty difficult sentence to understand, but consanguinity, as far as I understand it, means similarity with a recent parent or somebody in your DNA. So when they say indicating no recent consanguinity in his ancestry, I think what they're trying to say is that it shows a diversity within his DNA, I think. Continuing to read, we use the QPADM framework to model the genetic ancestry components that best represent the neural genome using a fully rotating model competition approach in which a set of candidates population are iteratively used as a source to construct one source, two source, and three source population ancestry models, whereas the remaining candidates are set as outgroup populations. We used a set of 13 populations from Neolithic and Chalcolithic West Asia, North Africa, and the North Mediterranean regions that predate the Nuarat individual as potential sources, and no single source model fitted the data for a model with Morocco. Instead, a single two source model met the significant criteria, which consisted of a mixture of 77.6 plus minus 3.8% ancestry represented by genomes from Middle Neolithic Morocco site of Sherat Rouzi, dated to 4780 to 4230 BCE, and the remainder most closely related to genomes from 9000 to 8000 BCE Neolithic Mesopotamia. In addition, two three source models showed similar ancestry proportions, but with a minor contribution of a third ancestry component represented by genomes from the Neolithic Chalcolithic Levant. Now, again, here's the part where, even though they provide the evidence, which, by the way, if you noticed, not all the DNA from ancient times that was considered either Mesopotamian or Moroccan was consistent. They found some that was consistent at one time, but they also found some inconsistent one. But let's keep reading. Although we caution that these results are based on a single Egyptian genome, they mirror another study that found evidence of gene flow from Mesopotamia and Zagros regions into surrounding areas, including Anatolia during the Neolithic, together with archaeological evidence for cultural exchange. These findings open the possibility that a wider cultural and demographic expansion originating in the Mesopotamian region reached both Egypt and Anatolia during this period. However, more recent migrations from the Eastern Fertile Crescent during the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age further altered the Anatolian and Levantine genetic landscapes. Say that again. So in that period, there are a possibility of Asiatics coming in, but because of the inconsistency of some of the genomes that you see, so it's not exactly the same. A further people must have come in. However, more recent migrations from the Eastern Fertile Crescent during the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age further altered the Anatolian and Levantine genetic landscape. Related movements may have introduced the Mesopotamian-like ancestry more recently in Egypt. We tested this by applying the same full QPADM model to target groups from the Bronze Age Anatolian and Levantine. Genomes from Bronze Age Levant were grouped into 8 archaeological sites, of which all models for Megiddo and Yehud were rejected. Supplementary table. Although we replicated previous findings that all Levantine Bronze Age groups trace 18.7 to 79.8% of their genome of the ancestry to Neolithic and Chalcolithic Levantine groups. We also detected ancestry from Neolithic Mesopotamia at 3 sites, considering the best fit models in proportion exceeding those in Neurat genome. However, the initial full QPADM model extended to include the Bronze Age Levant as a potential source. can effectively be rejected for the Neurot genome. So again, you can see here that the Neurot genome, though Middle Eastern in its origin, is not fully consistent with later, after its date, Levantines as a potential source can effectively be rejected for the Neurot genome. Supplementary information section, notably, the best model for the Neurot genome fits worse than these groups are included as reference groups. Supplementary information section, this means that we cannot exclude the possibility that the Neolithic Mesopotamian like ancestry in the Neurot genome could have arrived by means of more recent, unsampled intermediaries in the Levant. Although the timing of the admixture event cannot be estimated directly, Table 2 and Supplementary Note 4, this finding provides direct evidence of genetic ancestry related to Eastern Fertile Crescent in ancient Egypt. Archaeological evidence lends support to the early Neolithic shared regional ancestry between Egypt and West Asia, given its proximity. Egypt was one of the first external areas to adopt the Neolithic package that emerged across West Asia as early as the 6th millennium BCE or before, which could have corresponded with movements of people. This period is concomitant with the observed gene flow from Mesopotamia to Anatolia, which may have explained into Egypt as well in support a substantial change in auditometric and dental tissue proportions occurred approximately 6000 BCE in the Nile Valley, with general continuity thereafter, along with marked temporal differences in subsistence, such as domestication plants and greater sedentary and material culture, such as introduction of pottery. This is indicative of discontinuity between the Mesolithic 8th to 7th millennium BC and Neolithic populations. Cultural exchange, which by the way, they're alleging a super movement. Cultural exchange and trade then continued through the 4th millennium BCE when Mesopotamia, late Uruk period features filtered into the Nile Valley. During the late period, pre-dynastic period, trade might have been routed through the Mediterranean and Red Seas rather than the Sinai Desert, which seaborne mobility could explain a scenario in which the source population did not come into contact with the Chalcolithic Bronze Age Levantines. Our results indicate that this millennia long process might not have only included cultural transmission, but also migration and subsequent admixture. This is actually a very interesting part that they're saying here, where they're saying, which might answer the question of why, if we look at Israel, there isn't the same development, and also why the genetics of the people in Israel that have been alleged from the Middle East is different than those even of this individual. That maybe they came via the sea rather than traveling through land through the Fertile Crescent. Now, I think this is the part that shocked a lot of people because obviously, with all this talk of proximity and how close Africa, or the rest of Africa, is to Egypt, this is where it gets a little bit confusing. Now, it didn't shock me because, of course, I got my own reasons, but let's read what they say. Moreover, it is notable that both our QPADM modeling and admixture clustering excluded any substantial ancestry in the Neurot genome related to the 4,500-year-old genome from Mota, Ethiopia, or other individuals in Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa, and extended data, figure 5. Nevertheless, we found that the Neurot genome fits as an equally good source as Levant Chalcolithic groups for the West Eurasian related groups of East Africa pastoralists' genomes, but ancient DNA data are still missing for many putative source regions. So there's a lot of information in there, and I could go into, how this is not a complete rejection of African ancestry as some people have taken it. With caution, of course, they there is talks about how North African DNA had already been influenced by some group that would have been unique to North Africa. So a group that is would be considered Black African by today's standard, but is unique to the rest of Africa because it was in North Africa, and it influenced the North African DNA, and it's being isolated as a North African DNA thing, and it's present in people like Ethiopians, some Sudanese people, and some people in other places, but it cannot be isolated yet as whether it originates from East Africa or somewhere in Africa or the Middle East. This is something we have to keep in mind before we just chuck out the idea that this person has, as they say, any substantial ancestry from Africa. Okay, we're almost done. Ancestry in later Egypt. The Neural genome extends the genetic record of ancient Egyptian beyond previously published data from the third intermediate period. We modeled these later individuals using QPADM with putative source from a set of 9 populations from North Africa, including Urat, West Asia, and Greece, who live between the Old Kingdom and the Third Intermediate Period, and also include genomes from the Middle Neolithic Morocco and Neolithic Mesopotamia. For more models that tested the potential overfitting of these sources, we can reject all one source models, including one with 100% continuity from Neurat to the third intermediate period. Let's read that again. We can reject all one source models, including one with 100% continuity from Neurat to the third intermediate period. Two similar two source models fit the data, differing only in whether the Neurat or Middle Neolithic Moroccan individuals are one of the best fit sources in both models. The main source of ancestry is the Bronze Age Levant example. In the model with Middle Neolithic Morocco, these results are consistent with the third intermediate period genomes deriving part of their ancestry from local groups related to the Neurat individual, while evidence a significant increase of Levantine ancestors. Before I read the last page, let's break down what they're saying. What they're basically saying is that this Neurat individual, even if you just take the Middle Eastern sides only, seems to be unique to this area and unique to this time, to these areas and unique to this time, and that there is clear evidence of other Middle Eastern people coming in over the millennia, coming in over the thousands of years, which are different than this guy. I forgot what's that big word they used, meaning the ancestry is not consistent. Evidence of gene flow from the Levant by the time of the third intermediate period could be linked to the proposed Bronze Age Canaanite expansion starting at the end of the Middle Kingdom period on the basis of archaeological findings. Whether this was a gradual assimilation process or a rapid shift, such as the settlement of the Hyksos rulers, is still debated. Overall, this period also overlaps with the well-characterized late Bronze Age collapse that witnessed rapid societal and economic upheaval across the Mediterranean region, leading to or being caused by widespread population movements. However, temporal and geographic limitations of the current genomic data do not allow firm conclusions to be drawn. So keep that in mind. We next tested how present day Egyptian ancestry could be traced to Bronze Age populations living in North Africa, including the Nuerat individual, West Asia, Europe, and Sub Saharan Africa using QPADM. Despite substantial heterogeneity, most present day Egyptian genomes can be modeled as derived their ancestry from 5 sources related to Nuerat: Middle Neolithic Morocco, so Nuerat 32% to 74%, Middle Neolithic Morocco 28% to 72%, Bronze Age Levant 11 to 6% to about 57%, and fourth, the 4,500-year-old individual from Mota 7.4% to about 56%, and 5 to approximately 230-year-old individuals from Congo 4.8 to 52%. Now I'm going to assume that they're going to say the ones from Congo are probably due to slavery, and I'm going to assume that they're going to say the Mota one too, but probably not, because Mota has a Nubian or Sudanic reason that could be included. Thus, if tracing the ancestry of many present day Egyptians in our study to the Bronze Age, much of it would be found in groups related to the Nuerat, or alternatively to sources best represented by Middle Neolithic Morocco, from which approximately 80% of the Nuerat ancestry derives. The second most common ancestry component is related to the Bronze Age Levant, consistent with the ancestry detected in the third intermediate period individuals, Bronze Age Coxus ancestry in a fraction of the present day Egyptians, but is similar to Bronze Age Levant ancestry. Our models show a more recent arrival of East and West Africans ancestry in present day Egyptians. So keep that in mind. In present day Egyptians, it seems like there's a East and West increase that came later, which has also been previously suggested and dated to 27 generations ago using linkage disequilibrium based admixture dating. Moreover, we note that there is a substantial diversity in ancestry across Egypt. Approximately 20% of the present day Egyptian genome included here did not fit the model described above. This is why, by the way, I don't take their argument about proximity seriously, because obviously the one that's proximately closer to the Egyptians are other East Africans, including the Mota individual. And so if Mota is not necessarily an ancient Egyptian DNA, which they're just concluding that that's not based on their genetic study, they're just saying that if this is indicative of the other Egyptians who existed at the time, then it would disclude a large amount of people, including other Middle Eastern people from other places that have been sequenced, including people from Morocco, including people from Asia, the Levant, places like that. But that's only if you take this one individual as the conclusive Egyptian DNA, which I don't think you should. And then obviously they look at the modern people and they say there might have a consistency with the ancient Nuerat individual, but if they do, they only have a limited amount of DNA consistency, as you would expect with people who have been invaded, conquered, moved. Even let's take the slave trade into consideration. Why wouldn't they have increased DNA from other places? It wouldn't make any sense. But of course, they say, no, it's the same exact people. Well, it can't be. The DNA has already shown that it's impossible that the people who are there, no matter what they look like, no matter where they came from, it's impossible for them to be the exact same people. And then finally, to say our result demonstrates a feasible of ancient genome sequences from the earliest stages of the Egyptian dynastic civilizations. One possible explanation for the successful whole genome retrieval is the pot burial, which may have favored a degree of DNA preservation not previously reported in Egypt. This contributes to the roadmap for future research to obtain ancient DNA from Egypt, although our analyses are limited to the single Egyptian individual who, on the basis of his relatively high status burial, may not be representative of the general of the Eastern Fertile of the general population of our result revealed ancestry links to earlier North African groups and populations of the Eastern Fertile Crescent. Analogous links were indicated in our biological affinity analysis of dental traits and craniometrics of the Neurot individual, as well as the previous morphological studies based on full samples. The genetic links with the Eastern Fertile Crescent also mirror previously documented cultural diffusion, animals' writing systems, and pottery wheel, opening up a possibility of some settlements of people in Egypt during one or more of these periods. The Neurot genome also allowed us to investigate the Bronze Age roots of ancestry in late Egypt, highlighting the interplay between population movement and continuity in the region. Future whole genome sequencing of DNA from more individuals will allow for a more detailed and nuanced understanding of ancient Egyptian civilizations and its inhabitants. I'll be honest, the way that some people are presenting this information is a little too fiery. And I think this is why there's a lot of people who are pushing back against it as if it doesn't indicate anything of any significance, but it is significant. It does show that some people from the Middle East made their way to Egypt. We thought this might have happened, and we know this because I played you the video where I said it, and we thought that there must have been some influence on their culture, but to have actual genetic evidence, I think, changes things on how we must look at ancient Egypt and how we must look at the Sumerians and Mesopotamians. And to some degree, we should expect that at the same time, we will find some DNA. Hard to know if it's going to be as easy to find in Mesopotamia that shows the same level of genetic exchange. I think there's no way that it is one directional. And of course, this opens up the idea, the concept that people as far as Nubia could have made it to places like Mesopotamia, considering that their ship history, their travel boat history is so similar. For me, this is not a blow. For me, this is not an explosion. It's not a end of the worlder. It's not an Afrocentric punch or anything like that. For me, it just opens up the possibilities that human beings have had exchanges for a long time. By the way, I want to talk about this. There's a certain group of people that used to consider the ancient Egyptians white. I mean, some of them still consider them white today. I think all of this evidence has shut down any possibility of that happening. I think it's pretty obvious that the only groups that are in question, the only groups that are in who can fight for this particular thing are dark skinned Middle Easterners and basically any type of skin Africans. And I think that's where the real debate has headed. And I would say there is no evidence of this or that, but even the Morocco individuals, if you take it, remember we have Moroccan DNA that's from the Neolithic, that's from all these periods, that has sub-Saharan African DNA. Now, admittedly, it also has others, but again, Black Africans did not decide that only people who stop in Sudan are Black people. That was never our claim. That has never been our claim. That's a Western framing. And I'm happy to know that they were dark skinned. And I'm happy to know that they were a productive, explorative, rather than isolated tribe. Because a lot of people say that the Egyptians were isolated. I like the fact that now we can open up this concept and find out for real historically where we came from and why did we do what we do and why did it stop in Egypt? Why did the pyramids of this size stop in Egypt? There's also some people who have to apologize for going after people who are talking about cultural diffusion, saying that there's a lot of similarities between Mesopotamia and Egypt. And they said, oh, you're just linking two things that have nothing to do with each other. I think there's some people who are going to have to apologize for that now that the evidence is in. Anyway, like, share, subscribe for part 2 of this type of video.